The current COVID metrics are today's February 13th, 2023, and this week there were 193 reported cases of COVID-19 in Charlotte-Mecklenburg County, which shows a 16% decrease over the last 2 weeks. So everyone in the room is currently comfortable not to wear a mask. So the purpose of the Living Archive Project is to gather, preserve, and share local histories, stories, documents, visual imagery, and memories about the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on Black, Hispanic, Asian, Indigenous, and other minority communities in Mecklenburg County by means of audio and/or visual recorded interviews, documents, photography, and written work. The night school here at Queens is partnering with them to help conduct six interviews per group, which will fulfill the community service portion for our capstone class. So we're just going to introduce ourselves, and then we'll have you introduce yourself. Okay. So as an interviewer, my name is Lily Fry. I'm a senior here at Queens with a communications major and international studies minor, and I will be graduating in May.
Hi, my name is Kaya Shumaponde Scarborough. I am a senior at Queens as well. I am majoring in communications, minoring in sports management, and yeah.
So we're just gonna have you introduce yourself, just say your name, your position, how long you've been in the Charlotte area, where you're originally from, anything that just kind of is important to you when identifying yourself.
Okay. I'm Darryl White. I'm the Assistant Dean for Diversity, Inclusion, Community Engagement here at Queens. I've been working here for 6 years. I'm also a Queens double alum. I did my undergrad here, graduated in 1992, and just finished a master's degree back in 2021. I'm from Charleston, South Carolina, moved around a lot, spent 34 years in the military, U.S. Army, and just retired in 2020.
Okay, so our first question before getting into the hand map is just kind of to describe your physical appearance. If you had to describe to, say, a blind person, for example, how would you describe the way you look?
Okay, so I am 6'6", 6 feet 6 inches tall. I would say that I'm a pretty hefty guy. 240 pounds, very dark skinned.
Okay.
That's it?
Yeah,
okay.
That works.
Yeah.
Okay, so everyone kind of knows what the hand map is when they're watching these videos, so just kind of share about your hand map. What is something that you felt like repeated on it, or something that stuck out to you when you were doing it?
So as I was doing the hand map, there were some things that were pretty easy, like when we talked about the journey, journeys that I've been on. And so my military journey is a big part of who I am. Mm-hmm. And so that was the first thing that came to mind. And also this whole idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I consider that a journey that I continue to be on every day. And just my education as well, because I was the first-time college attendee and graduated in my family, and so that was another huge journey for me just to be able to do that. So just to when I think about the hand map and I think about like some of the questions that were asked, I think the thing that stood out to me the most was just some of my feelings during the pandemic, and so I said that I was really sad. It was really challenging, and it was I felt hopeless at times. Just felt like I was just seeing these numbers grow every day, and it was just felt hopeless, not really being able to do anything about it. So yeah, those are just some of the things that stood out.
So who did you spend most of your time with during COVID, during that time?
So during COVID, we were at home. So me and my wife. My wife is a school teacher, so she was in one room working. I was in another room working. Mm-hmm. And my at the time, my son was working here. He was working in the admissions office, and so he was also up in his room doing admissions calls. And then my daughter was a student here, so she was in another room doing her work. So yeah, the four of us were at home with our dog, spending time together.
Gotcha. It was a family affair.
Yeah.
So we're just kind of going to get into some demographic questions and then hopping into COVID. Some of them might be a little repetitive, so if there's something that you might not want to answer because you've already answered it, we can just skip right over it. Okay. So where's home for you right now? Is that the Charlotte area?
Yeah, yep. So home is Charlotte, okay. Yes.
And where were you born?
I was born in Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay. How long have you been in the Charlotte area?
I've been in the Charlotte area since 1990.
Okay. So kind of describe your experience during the last 2 years and more of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially being in the Charlotte area and being here, having been here so long.
Yeah, so being here, I'm an extrovert, so I like to interact with people, and not that I didn't enjoy interacting with my family at home, but it's just that you lose that sense of really that connectedness of being in the same room with people.
Mm-hmm.
I think Charlotte is a place that has grown a lot since I've been here, and just to be able to get out and be in the presence of other people. And as we got into the pandemic, it almost felt like it was like going backwards, back to kind of what it used to be, where there wasn't really much to do around Charlotte. And you would go to the grocery store and you would hardly see anybody. And so it was just like a different time during the COVID experience. As we came back on campus and we started, getting engaged a little bit more, it was still somewhat of a challenge, having to wear a mask every day, because I feel like you don't really get the same feeling of interaction with people, when you're wearing a mask. You can't see who's smiling. You can't see, it's just something about, actually being able to see people's faces when you're doing things. And then also, it just took a while for people to start getting comfortable coming back in spaces together as well. So, whenever there was an event going on, you may or may not get a decent number of people to come out because people are still uncomfortable with that.
I'm going to grab the hand map for you, just because I think we're done with those questions for the most part. So what do you remember of the early days? I know, obviously, we were all on campus when we found out that campus would be closing down for at least a couple weeks.
Yeah.
But what do you remember of those first couple days, those first couple weeks of lockdown?
Yeah. So, I remember the first day when we got the message about COVID. And I was walking around campus with the chaplain, and we were just, we was like, let's just go and, check up on people. Mm-hmm. And we ended up right outside by the terrace, the Queens Hall Terrace, and there were a lot of seniors came out there with their cap and gowns, mm-hmm. and they were, just embracing each other, and they were taking pictures, and, they were just kind of like, okay, we don't know what's going to happen after this. Mm-hmm. So we hung out with them for a while, and then we walked around, and I was running into different people. Some of the athletes were just, really looking dejected because their seasons had been cut short. We had no idea how long this was going to be. And so, after we all went home and we were told that, okay, it's going to be maybe a week, at least we're going to be home for at least a week. And mm-hmm. So, it was just kind of like, okay, I'm getting up and, I'm still supposed to be working, but, just trying to figure things out. Like, what am I going to do all day just like sitting at home? And so, so basically for those first couple of weeks, it was just like, okay, get up, take a shower. I don't have to think about what I'm going to wear. Mm-hmm. So, you just, then we would go and sit outside. Me and my family, we would go sit outside and, just kind of like, wow, how long is this thing gonna go on for? Mm-hmm. So it was just like kind of a repetitive thing every day for the first few weeks, just trying to figure out like, what is this all about? How long is this gonna happen? And then you start seeing all these numbers grow, and then it's like kind of more fear starts to grow, because it's like, okay, wow, we don't know how people contract it. We don't know how, whether or not it's even safe to like walk past people on the street. We would, take walks during the day, and we weren't sure about anything like that. So it was just like really crazy how we were like distancing ourselves from people. We're walking down the street and somebody would walk wide into the street, and, we would just kind of like, and you wouldn't really stop and talk to anybody because you just weren't really sure. So it was different.
Gotcha. How do you think that experiences like that affected your friendships and also the relationships within your family? Obviously, you were sharing a home with your wife and your 2 kids, mm-hmm. but when it comes to extended family and also friends from work, but friends from outside of the Queens community as well. Yeah.
So I know that there's still opportunities. I'm not big on social media, so I didn't really do social media. And so I think it really did impact some of those relationships, just basically like people who I would see every day, and I would talk with them, and I think everybody was just trying to figure it out. Maybe people were connecting with their extended families, and and so forth. And it was somewhat depressing in a way, just kind of sitting at home and almost. It was almost to the point of I didn't really want to talk to many people, just because it's like people were so depressed about what was going on, and so that's all we would talk about. And so it was more about like, let's just sit in the backyard and just talk about stuff, just watch the birds come and eat from the bird feeder, and just those kind of things, more mindfulness types of things, as opposed to like, let's just get on the phone and talk. So I think it did kind of separate me from people who I was, pretty close with, because and I think that could have been avoided, but just trying to figure things out, I think that kind of just, like, okay, I'm not sure what's going on, and it probably was a time that I should have done more reaching out to people and talking with people, but it was like more of this, I'm just going to sit here and just try to, figure things out.
That makes sense. What do you think are some kind of other challenges that you faced during the pandemic, and kind of how that's affected who you are now and what your routine looks like now? Obviously, COVID-19 is still existing, but the pandemic has definitely passed in the way that we were experiencing it before.
Yeah.
So how do you think your life, but also the world, has kind of shifted now that we are kind of in after pandemic life?
Yeah, so I think, for me, I was ready to kind of get back to the normalcy of, being around people. And, as I've talked to more people, some people kind of got used to the fact that, okay, I can work from home and I can just be by myself. And people want to do more of that. There's some people who I talk with, they want to do more of this, being able to work from home, where I feel like that kind of starts to pull you away from people. I think so much of our DNA is to be around people, and I think it started to pull us further away. And I think it made me closer with my family, my family at home with me. But again, I think some of the challenges was like, just some of the interactions that you have with people is where, it kind of drives my, my energy, my thought processes and things like that. And I think that, we just didn't have that. And so it was just really a matter of kind of getting back on track with that after the pandemic.
Gotcha. I guess, what are some good things that you've learned through your experience during the pandemic? I know obviously there's a lot of negatives, and sometimes that's a little easier to talk about. And I know you've mentioned that a lot of people got used to the working at home, and some people liked it. But you being an extrovert, that's something that you wanted to you were ready to get away from working at home.
Yeah.
But what are some good things that came out of that experience?
So for me, I've always felt like I've been, was resilient, but I feel like that helped me to really see more of that resilience, just being able to be strong enough to know that, we're going to get through this, even though there were times where, it was just more that, wow, this is pretty tough, but, just kind of being resilient. So I think a lot of people, maybe develop resilience through that pandemic. I think also more innovation, it's like figuring out like how can you still do some things despite what's going on, and I think, you become a little bit more creative in terms of how you do things. A lot of things that I do is, programming. And so, figuring out like how to still do some interesting programming, but doing it virtually, so I think it really helped us also to just value life more. I think, we look at how quickly people were leaving this earth, and I knew a few people personally who died from the pandemic, and so it just really helped you to kind of say, okay, I need to, for one thing, live life every day, and then also just value your life and value the lives of other people as well.
How do you think that overall, you kind of touched on it already, but the experiences like shaped you as a person, especially going forward, both in your career but in your personal life?
Yeah, so I think it's shaped me to the point of like just never thinking that something can't happen. You think that, I'd never thought in a million years something like that we would experience something like that. We've heard about the great plague and all these other things that happened way back in history, but you just think that, oh yeah, nothing like that will ever happen. And it was almost the same as like, when 9/11 hit, you don't think about things like that. So I wouldn't go around just like kind of having my guard up all the time, expecting something to happen, but at least, just knowing that there's always a chance that something could happen, and just being mentally prepared to overcome any kind of challenges that you have. And so I think that's where it helped more of my mental capacity, just to know that, okay, if something happens, we can get through it, and I think that's the good thing about it, is that we've seen that we can get through it, even though, we lost a lot of people, but the fact is, we can be strong enough to work through these things.
Is there anything that you personally did to make an impact on the community that you're in, or your community at home during the pandemic?
Yeah, well, like I said, I did some, programming that I otherwise maybe would not have done. During the pandemic, we were also going through the, racial, issues within the community, and so I did some programming around that, which really allowed me to reach people from all over the country, because it was virtual, and I think that was really helpful to bring people together. And also, I did a lot more with, our campus community, athletic teams and all, to be able to have conversations around things, related to the pandemic, as well as the racial things that were going on. And so I think those are two of the, just the key pieces of what I felt like my contribution was during that time.
If you don't mind talking about it, if you don't, it's totally fine. But how do you think that the pandemic and everything that was going on racially within the United States, how do you think that one exacerbated the other, and just kind of what was your kind of take on it from your own perspective? It was a weird time, because obviously things were still going on, but we were still being advised to stay at home.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of what was your outlook of your experience, just kind of seeing that on the news and in different communities around the country?
Yeah, so, as I was looking at it, again, I felt some of that, hopelessness of what was going on, because we were in a pandemic, and then we were dealing with racial issues around the country, and so my first thought was that, wow, we got all these people out here protesting and getting together. A lot of us in the Black community are afraid of vaccines and things like that, and so just like to get people even once the vaccines even became available, because when we first started the pandemic, it wasn't available to everybody anyways, and so I was, I think, more fearful of what was going to happen, because people were out there protesting, and we weren't really exactly sure how the virus was being transmitted, and so I was more fearful, like, wow, we're going to lose that many more people, because people are in these close proximity to one another out here protesting, and but I was also upset that the way how people were portraying, just like, I guess for one thing, we had already gone through this thing with the brutality against this Black man, against George Floyd. And then, to hear the media talking about, us, the protests and how it was going on, and they were looking at it all as being, we're just out there just to be able to riot and, go and do unlawful things, whereas they weren't seeing the big picture of the fact that, this is something that was terrible that happened to George Floyd, and even though there was a pandemic going on, people still needed to come out and get their frustrations out. So those two things were boiling over together. People are like locked in the house, and that kind of brings a sense of anger, and then this other thing that happens, just really starts to make it boil over into it was really not a pretty scene to have both of those things happening at the same time.
Yeah. How do you think, in a more present day aspect, how do you see some of the effects of COVID and also everything that was happening due to George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movements and everything like that? What are you kind of seeing now that has changed because of some of those things?
Yeah. So I think, especially because of George Floyd, something that hasn't changed is that, we're still seeing the police brutality against, black males. But I think people are more aware. I think people are paying closer attention to what's going on in society, and people are willing to take action more than they probably were in the past. Because of things like that. In terms of the pandemic, I think that I've seen, like I said, personally, I know that I value life more than I did in the past. And I think I'm seeing that from a lot of other people too. People are starting to say, I'm going to take this trip that I've always wanted to do. I'm going to start to live my life and do some things because, you just never know when that final day comes. And so I think people are stepping outside of their comfort zone a little bit more. Also, I see a lot more people are getting involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like people are saying, hey, I want to learn more. I want to do more, and I think that's really helped a lot in terms of us people being able to come together as well.
Gotcha. Do you have any other questions before I ask the final question? So my final question is kind of really just to wrap it up. Do you have any additional stories or experiences to share about your experience during COVID-19? Something that maybe stuck out to you that we haven't talked about already?
Mm-hmm. Well. Yes, I would say that, a lot of people, I think, developed hobbies or found something else within themselves during that time. I think there's probably a lot of people who have said, hey, I don't really want to go back to work where I was working before. I'm going to start my own business. I'm going to, or I really want to kind of pursue something else that I've always wanted to do because, I'm at home now, so I got more time on my hands. For myself, I felt like I've always really been fascinated with birds, and so I was able to spend way more time in my backyard and get more bird feeders going and just sit back and like I said, mindfulness was never really something that I kind of practiced, but I think being able to just sit back and not really listen to, normally if you're out there, you're hearing cars and the hustle and bustle and everything. It's to be able to just experience more nature was something that really was helpful to me. And my family also got into it. They knew how much I was into the birds and, identifying different birds that were coming in. And so they started kind of doing the same thing. So yeah, I think just the emergence of different hobbies and different people getting out of their comfort zone and deciding some different path that they wanted to take, whether it was a career path or something else. I think that was really good something good that came out of the pandemic too.
Has that carried over now into kind of this post-pandemic life that we're kind of figuring out here for you?
Yeah, for sure. I think as I sat home and I was thinking about it, I kind of continued to always think about mindfulness now, what kind of things I might do just to do that. And yeah, my bird feeders definitely for sure, I continue to be big on feeding the birds and kind of understanding more about some of the patterns of birds. And I'm not going to say that I'm an expert with that, but it's just it's something that I've kind of continued to carry on, even though I'm not at home as much, because now it's back to the commute of going to work and getting home in the evenings. And but whenever I do have time on the weekends or whatever, I like to sit in the backyard and just, still watch the birds.
That's nice. My last and final question, just to wrap everything up. 100 years from now, if people in Charlotte or anywhere around the world were going through kind of what we experienced during the pandemic, what would your number one piece of advice be for someone that might be listening or watching?
I would say that people should bond together, find something that, instead of focusing on the negative things that you really can't control, try to find something that will make you feel good, something that you can do to make you feel like your time is not just being wasted, like you're not just sitting there feeling helpless. So whether it's you decide that you want to start to read a book, which if you're not an avid reader, you start reading, you start, like I said, where for myself, it was, doing birds, just like learning more about birds. But I would say that, yeah, just know that there's like other things that you can do to kind of occupy your time and feel like you're being productive. But more than anything else, I would say that, yeah, try to stay connected with the people who you've been connected with, and I didn't do a good job of that, but I would hope that others would actually really take the time and say, okay, we have a platform to be able to stay in touch with people, and so like be intentional about that because the time just flies so quickly.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.